Hand traps are some of the strongest cards in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! These cards are extremely powerful, but with so many different effects, activation conditions, and tiny differences between them, selecting the right cards for your deck and the decks you're going to be facing can often be the difference between winning a tournament and missing out on top cut. Today, we'll highlight some of the most popular hand traps in Yu-Gi-Oh!, what they do, why they're good, and when you should consider them for your strategies. Hand trap is a catch-all term for any card with an effect that you can use directly from your hand, usually to interrupt your opponent's plays. Most hand traps are generic, meaning they're not tied to a specific strategy, making them playable in almost any deck. Each hand trap has its own unique effect, making them better or worse in different situations, and there are often special restrictions for when you can play them. When you're building a deck for modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, the cards you need for your specific strategy will usually take up half to 3/4 of your 40-card deck. The rest of your deck space is usually dedicated to cards that stop your opponent, and this is where hand traps come in. The first hand trap that we'll look at is Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. Ash Blossom is easily the most popular hand trap in Yu-Gi-Oh! History, and with good reason. It stops your opponent from searching for any card from their deck. It can only stop one search, so you want to make sure you use it at the right time, but a well-played Ash Blossom can absolutely win the duel. Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring is best in formats where the top decks all rely on key searching effects to fuel their lines of play. If you look at the best decks from any format since it was released, you will almost always see Ash Blossom either in the main or the side deck of those top cut strategies. Droll and Lockbird's another super popular hand trap, and it works a little differently than Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. In order to use Droll and Lockbird, you have to let your opponent resolve at least one search effect or draw effect, but once they do, Droll and Lockbird lets you shut them off from any further searching for the remainder of the turn. While Droll and Lockbird was first released in Star Strike Blast back in 2010, it didn't start seeing competitive play until early 2015 when Nekroz decks were all the rage. It then saw play again in 2019 as a very popular way to combat the powerful Sky Striker deck at the time, and in more recent years it's been great to counter decks like Snake Eyes and Fluanderies. Droll and Lockbird is useful against decks that utilize cards like Bonfire, Snake Eye Ash, Pot of Prosperity, and even Terraforming. While your opponent will still get that first search, they'll lose out on anything else for the rest of the turn, and that's especially powerful against cards like Terraforming, where they're going to want to use a field spell that probably gets them an additional search as well, so they lose out on that effect for the turn. Droll and Lockbird sees play primarily in formats where decks rely on making multiple searches all throughout their combo lines. When you have decks that play searching cards like Reinforcement of the Army or Bonfire, the ability to stop those future searches is incredibly powerful and can turn the tide of any duel. Ghost Belle and Haunted Mansion's a really cool hand trap that drifts in and out of the competitive scene with each format. While it works like Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, it only cares about cards that mess with the graveyard as opposed to the deck. So instead of stopping cards like Reinforcement of the Army or Pot of Prosperity, it halts powerful cards like Monster Reborn, Soul Release, and the ever-popular Bestial monsters. Ghost Belle shines in any format where the graveyard is really important. When cards are constantly moving from the graveyard, Ghost Belle sees more play to shut off those effects. One of the strongest things about Ghost Belle actually is that it stops the activation of whatever it's shutting off, whereas most other hand traps only stop the card at resolution. Ghost Belle first started seeing play as a way to combat Orcus decks in 2019. It was used to negate the effect of Orcus Symbol Skeleton when players tried to bring back Dingirsu, the Orcus of the Evening Star, from the graveyard. It also had niche uses against Sky Striker decks since it could stop the effect of Sky Striker Ace Kagari and Shark Cannon. Effect Veiler is one of Yu-Gi-Oh's oldest hand traps, and it still sees play today. Veiler works best in any format where monsters on the field are generating powerful effects. They don't have to be effects that search other cards or mess with the graveyard like Ash Blossom and Ghost Belle. Veiler works against just about any monster. Another cool thing about Effect Veiler is that you can use its negation at any time during your opponent's main phase, so you don't have to chain it directly to the effect you want to negate. Effect Veiler is really useful against cards with multiple effects, since it negates the card outright. While Ash Blossom and Ghost Belle only stop a singular activation, Effect Veiler turns off the entire card's effect. Veiler is usually a popular hand trap, dating all the way back to when it was first released in Duelist Revolution back in 2010. It was especially useful in the Goki format in 2018 to stop cards like Isolde, Two Tails of the Noble Knights from resolving. Ghost Mourner and Moonlit Chill is the newest hand trap that we'll be looking at today, and it functions a lot like Effect Veiler, but it has more specific activation requirements. You can only activate Ghost Mourner when your opponent special summons a monster. That means it's a little bit more situational, but just like Effect Veiler, it fully negates the monster's effect. And on top of that, it's got some additional burn damage equal to the monster's attack if it leaves the field. Ghost Mourner is strong against monsters that activate right when they're summoned. Having an extra monster negate that puts a blanket negation on that monster is super powerful in certain formats, so Ghost Mourner can be very strong, but it's not always going to be the right fit. Nibiru, the primal being, is one of the strongest hand traps in the game, and it's not one of those hand traps that's useful against certain cards. Instead, it nukes entire strategies. That's what makes it so good. After your opponent has summoned at least 5 monsters in a single turn, whether it's their turn or yours, you can use Nibiru to wipe the field. Then you're going to summon that Nibiru to your field and a token to your opponent's field that is as strong as all of the monsters that you blasted away. That might sound like a bad trade because they get a really big monster, but it's usually worth it to stop your opponent's crazy combos from finishing you off. Nibiru was released in 2019's Megatons, and it immediately saw play in almost every deck for the rest of the year, and it continued to see play in almost every format. It's been a key part of the metagame since its release. Nibiru is really useful against any deck that throws a bunch of monsters onto the field in the main phase. Most duelists will purposely try to set up their boards and play around Nibiru with a negation effect like Appaloosa, Bow of the Goddess, or try to set up their field so they have a contingency plan just in case, so Nibiru might not always work. With that being said, one of the best ways to use Nibiru is to combo with a card like Change of Heart to take the Primal Being token and wipe out your opponent's life points. The final hand trap that we're going to talk about today is one that's so powerful it's despised by many duelists. Dimension Shifter has one of the strongest effects of all hand traps that we've looked at. And you can only use Dimension Shifter if you have no cards in your graveyard. But when it resolves, cards can't hit the graveyard for 2 whole turns. Everything that would be sent to the graveyard gets banished instead. Shifter's incredibly powerful against decks that rely on sending cards to the graveyard. But because of its requirements and the fact that it affects both players, you really only have to worry about it if you're playing against something like Fluandereeze or even a Kashtira deck. Strategies that ignore their own graveyard are where this card is at home. Most decks don't play this card, but the ones that do gain a huge advantage. While Dimension Shifter was initially released at the same time as Nibiru in 2019, it didn't really start seeing a ton of popularized playtime until the summer of 2021, when Fluandereeze debuted in Burst of Destiny. Since then, Dimension Shifter has been a huge part of competition and has appeared in a variety of decks that don't need to use their graveyard. Hand traps may not be the flashiest part of any Yu-Gi-Oh deck, but they're often the most crucial. They're a huge part of the competitive landscape and help ensure that you don't just lose on the spot. Finding the right hand traps for your deck and your specific metagame is important, but with the cards that we just mentioned today, you're well prepared for your next tournament.